All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. Thanks for your patience. Getting off to a little bit of a slow start here, a couple minutes late. So appreciate everybody hanging out with me here. I'm going to real quick ping the channel, let everybody know in the Office Hours channel and Slack that we're live. And we'll go ahead and just get started here. It is Wednesday, January 5th of 2022. Thanks again for tuning in here. If this is your first time watching this is a live open Q&A style show where I answer questions we get in YouTube chat, in the Office Hours channel, in Slack, and through email about SaberSim, about DFS, whatever you guys want to talk about. So we've got a handful of questions here in the queue already today. So we'll just go ahead and start working our way down the list. Looks like we've got a couple questions about late swap, some contest selection stuff. Looks like a lot of late swap today, so it should be good. We'll go ahead and just start jumping in here. I'm going to go ahead and start this. This is a question from Rough 'em Up. Let me go ahead and get our SaberSim pulled up as well here, and we'll get this going. So the question was, is there a way when I late swap to make sure it keeps the player at a certain percentage? For example, if I have a guy I want in 50% of my lineups, if I late swap, won't that ignore any exposure settings I've set in the initial build? So a couple notes on this here. Let me go ahead and get an entries file loaded in here, and we'll do a couple builds here and start talking about this. But should have some entries here. I'll give this just a sec here. Okay, cool. All right, cool. So we've got some entries here. Let me go ahead. We'll need to get some lineups in here as well. So we'll go ahead. We'll do all this together here. Always good for me to have an opportunity to get some real lineups in and get my reserved entries out as well on stream, because that is something I forget to do from time to time. Always best practice. So let's get some initial lineups in here. When you fill, I'll say what was gonna talk about here. When you fill your entries in with the entry editor, we will pull over those exposure settings in. So, for example, let's say we want to cap some ownership on this Pacers value, maybe. So maybe let's say, you know what, we want to match the field on these guys instead of being totally overweight on these guys, and maybe we can go find a guy like maybe Embiid, right? Low owned play that we want to make sure that we're particularly over on, right? So that looks good here. We'll go ahead and save this, and then we can go over to the entries here and fill these. And when we fill, we're going to see here that these exposure settings are going to be ported over here, right? So that's all good. That's the easiest way, first of all, to just get these exposures here in. And these exposures, so I know there are often some questions about this. These exposures will be followed when we late swap. So if we were now to late swap, these would be, again, kind of, you know, followed in the late swap process, right? So we'll go ahead, we'll start this and just get these in. And late swap and put them in. So we can go ahead and edit this as well. So let's say like some news breaks or something like that. You know, let's say, I don't know, maybe we get some news. I don't know, some kind of news. Maybe Aaron Gordon or somebody is sitting and Jokic's projection has gone way up, but we don't want to be totally overweight on Jokic. We want to like cap our ownership. We don't want 50% for whatever reason or another. We can put 50 in here. And even though it's 14 right now in the current lineups that we have in there, if we then proceed to late swap, it will make sure that all of these rules continue to get followed here in the late swap build. Now, one of the things I know there is a little bit of a limitation, something that's a little bit annoying here, is as you start late swapping throughout the night, these exposures. So we'll go ahead, we'll say, okay, this is our late swap. We'll go ahead, we'll upload this. And then we go back to the entries. These are going to update here, right? So now this reads late swap, and our exposures are gone now, right? Because it's corresponding to this original build. And I know that's kind of frustrating. I know that's kind of annoying. What I would recommend doing, I think one thing that's nice about that is it gives you an opportunity to kind of check each time you late swap and make sure, do I still want to honor these original exposures that I was going with when I started here, right? Is this still what I need? Do I still want to tackle the slate in this particular way? As the slate goes on, obviously more players get locked into the lineups too, so their exposures aren't going to change. But what I would recommend doing is keeping, maybe have a list of a couple of players that you're really kind of focusing or targeting on that particular slate, and just enter that exposure back in here when you're late swapping, right? So, maybe we're late swapping. I don't know when Embiid's game starts, right? I assume it's probably one of the earlier ones in the night, but if we want to make sure that we continue to maintain that exposure to Embiid in our late swap process, we pop those exposures in here. But that's the easiest way to kind of track that as the slate goes on. So hopefully that kind of answers the question. I know, again, that's maybe the slightest bit annoying at the moment, maybe a little bit frustrating that you have to put some of those exposures back in here when you're late swapping. But I think the nice thing about it is it does give you that opportunity to check on that and make sure that you still want to approach that player in a certain way, even after news has changed. And that's actually, the reason why this is kind of set up the way it is at the moment, right? We don't want anyone to get blindsided by an exposure they set at lock. That is meaning that they don't get any access to the new smash play because of other exposures they've set. So it's kind of a little bit of a mixed bag where, yes, there's a little bit of manual work. If you want to maintain some of these exposures, you need to reset them here in the late swap process. But it also allows you to potentially late swap quickly if you need to, and not get held up by previous exposures that you don't even want to necessarily worry about anymore. So, but these exposures, if you enter a value in here, will be honored when you do the late swap process. So that is what I would recommend doing there. But good question there. Let me know if there's any follow-up there. And then it seems like there's another late swap question here, so we'll have to take a look at this here and unpack this one. This is from JD's dog, JDS dog. He said, there's times when I want to swap a specific player in rather than swap a specific player out. What's the best way of doing this without late swap? Related, when this happens, I'm often wanting to reduce exposure to 2 to 3 players and boost exposure to a different group of 2 to 3 players. Assuming that there isn't functionality to swap for groups of players, that is, lineups that have any of player A, B, or C swap if possible to X, Y, or Z. It would be great to late swap from a subset of entries for a given contest. For example, if I have 150 and I want to late swap any lineup that doesn't have Jamar Chase, but keep intact all lineups with him. I know one way would be to edit my CSV file so that it doesn't include any lineups with Chase and then re-download to SaberSim, but hopefully there's a better way to do this. Yeah, at the moment, I think kind of what you have described is what you are going to have to do if you want to get this granular, where you're saying, I can like perfectly get the idea here, right? Like, you're not winning without Jamar Chase on last week's slate. So take any lineup that doesn't have Chase in it and swap it probably very aggressively, right? Get to some very low owned plays, some high variance plays to give yourself a shot at maybe taking something down with a very low owned lineup without Chase in it. There isn't an easy way to do that right now at the moment in the app without going in, doctoring your CSV file a little bit and removing the lineups that don't have Chase. We want to, it is on our roadmap in general, to add a functionality to late swap lineups differently or separately based on what the current status is in the lineup. So, maybe lineups under a certain point total get late swapped one way, lineups over a certain point total get late swapped another way. I think the idea of doing this with an individual player is kind of interesting as well. So, maybe take a subset of lineups that include a certain player and late swap them with one settings and late swap other lineups with a different set of settings. I think all that's actually really cool. I think that's a good idea. I'll pass that along. We want to make this a little bit more robust in the future. There's just probably not a very easy way to do this exactly the way you've described at the moment. I do think on the exposure standpoint, if you said reduce exposure to 2 to 3 players and boost exposure to another group of 2 to 3 players, I think that's a perfect example of something that you can do here in this exposure table, right? You can handle it on a per player basis as well. If there were a couple, or per position basis as well, is what I meant. So if there were a couple wide receivers, for example, that you wanted to maintain under exposure on, you could set those max exposures here in the late swap, boost some min exposure to a couple other guys and run it. and it'll work. You may not get the perfect level of granularity here where it looks like what you're trying to do is literally take out every instance or most of the instances of 2 to 3 players and replace them consistently with another group of 2 to 3 players. That's something that's going to be a little tricky as well. I would say, I mean, you could take some use of the quick swap tool to kind of get this done. So for example, if you wanted to do something where you said, you're blanket taking all instances of Jokic. I know this is NBA and I know the question was written here for NFL, but this should work. If you wanted to take all instances of Jokic and replace with Embiid, for example, and do something like that, you could quickly kind of do this and then do that for your other players, but that's only going to work for 1-to-1 swaps. Not a very easy way at the moment to say something like, take this group of 3 and swap them to any of the players in this group. I think these are all really cool ideas. I can definitely see the use case for these or why you would want to do these mid-slate. And it's our plan to kind of make the late swap tool continue to be a little bit more robust in the future. But at the moment, stuff is a little bit tricky, I think, to do without some doctoring of the entries file. So, but Cody said the only issue with doing it by point totals, if your only early guy was Chase, it would still late swap that lineup, right? Yeah, and the goal here is not so that like these are necessarily blanket rules that are just like every lineup under a certain point total has to get swapped this way. That would be one of the options, but not necessarily the only way of doing this. The point here, or really the purpose of what we're trying to do with this update, which is going to be a little ways out, just to set reasonable expectations, is just to give more control so that you could group lineups in a different set of ways and say late swap these like this. So that might be based on total lineup ownership. That might be based on total lineup points. That might be based on total quarters remaining, if we can do it that way. That might be between certain conditional players, late swap all lineups that include or don't include this player this way. We're kind of still talking through what that's going to look like. I think probably up until this point, I think we were thinking more on the total points or total ownership standpoint. But this idea of conditional players, I think, is really cool. And I will pass that along. One of the things we have talked about is doing something with kind of a conditional player where, let's say in a basketball slate, for example, a certain player gets ruled out and you only want to late swap lineups that included that player to begin with. We've talked about creating a separate version of a late swap where you could do that. So if Embiid gets ruled out, you could say only late swap my Embiid lineups, which in basketball isn't probably what you would want to necessarily do. Maybe not even necessarily in football. But I know in baseball, for example, right, that's something that happens often where like maybe Mookie Betts gets scratched after lock and you want to late swap, but if you late swap everything, all of your lineups get rebuilt. And in reality, all that you really need to happen is your Dodger stacks need to get rebuilt, right? So having a tool of like a conditional player for late swapping like that, where you say, this is pretty impactful news, but it doesn't really disrupt the entire feeling of the slate like a late scratch does in football or basketball. So only late swap my Dodgers lineups. That's like something else we've talked about. Again, I think the late swap tool as it is, the fact that you can late swap with just a couple clicks of the button while taking into account ownership and correlation and variance of players without having to redo groups and things like that makes this a pretty powerful tool, but we want to continue to add more control. So these are things that we're talking about and adding. Yeah, with the original question here from JD's dog here, I think at the moment, if you want to get this granular, the best advice I would be able to give is to probably go in and doctor the entries file to only upload the specific lineups you want to late swap, which I know is not ideal, but I think that's kind of the best way to do it at the moment. So, okay, cool. So a couple questions about golf from Steve here. He said, new to golf, but I see lock is in the middle of the day. Can I set lineups early before I go to work, or is there news coming out right up to lock? Good question. So it's really only early in the season that we're going to have the luxury of this. While they are golfing in Hawaii, we get that right middle of the day lock time for most of us in the mainland United States here, which is pretty nice. I would say in general, golf isn't really a sport where you need to focus too much on building lineups right up against lock. Typically, most of the time, throughout most of the middle of the season, lock is very early in the morning, anywhere from like 4, 5, 6, 7 in the morning, at least my time. What I will often do in general is set lineups at night before I go to bed, and maybe generally set an alarm to make sure. I think the main thing that you're looking for is you just want to make sure nobody withdraws. That's the big thing that can bite you, is just a golfer that withdraws from the tournament. The communications of golfer withdrawals from the PGA Tour has never been very great, so sometimes it takes everybody by surprise. That's kind of the main thing you're looking for. I wouldn't say that happens often, and I would say, if you're setting your lineups for Thursday of this week, I think you're probably fine setting your lineups in the morning before you go to work. And if you can, maybe 10 minutes before lock. If you want to be perfectly careful, maybe keep an eye out, check, and see if there's been any news, if there's been any withdrawals. If there has, a lot of times you can just kind of either rebuild or just do a very quick swap to get those guys out. But it's not a sport at all where, in general, I would say, where there's like breaking news right up until lock every single night, like there is in NBA or anything like that. So, and then the second question here said, from using SaberSim over the past season, I've gotten the feeling that SaberSim excels in showdown contests. Do you feel the same may be true for golf, or does the model do well for the full slate? I think golf showdowns, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. I think when you're talking about rounds 1, 2, and 3 showdowns, the first 3 rounds, you are taking what is already a very high variance sport where, to be completely honest, I think the edge is smaller than other sports, and you're even reducing that further, right? As hard as it is to make accurate projections and predictions about an entire golf tournament as a whole, it gets even harder when you're talking about on a single round. I think one spot where there is a definite edge, and Max actually mentioned this in Slack yesterday, and there's a whole video about it on our YouTube channel, is round 4 showdowns. What is very useful about the round 4 showdowns is that final finishing position ends up making up a big portion of what a golfer scores. And you can't really accurately account for the finishing position of the golfer if you're not doing a hole by hole simulation, right? So doing a hole by hole simulation allows us to actually kind of really look at the real ranges of outcomes of finishing positions of golfers, and I think can give you a little bit of an edge overall on those round 4 showdowns. So I think that's something to look at. Personally, for me, golf showdowns is not something that really makes up a big part of my contest selection mix. Golf it's a thin edge sport. It really is. It's something that I enjoy playing, but I scale back my bankroll a little bit just to play the main slates in general. The showdowns I would be pretty cautious with, because I think they're just going to play very, very high variance. I think it can be hard to get an edge in a single round of golf. But I think those round 4 showdowns are a good place to start. I also think the contest selection for round 4 showdowns are going to be a lot better than any of the round 1, 2, or 3 showdowns. So, but I think people tilt enter those a lot for all the rounds, just because it's easy over the course of the 4 days. It's easy to kind of you have too much time to tilt for people that like playing golf DFS, and it's very easy to just jump into one of those showdowns if your main slate lineups are looking poor. So, but Josh said, let's get some b-ball talk going. Go for it, man. Fire away. Happy to talk about whatever you guys want. There's still a couple other questions in the queue here, so we'll get to these. But if you got basketball questions for me, let's hear it. So, JD's, I assume this is JD's dog, but maybe it's JDS dog. Let me know. But he said, do you disclose EVs of running unmodified default settings for different size contests? I don't have the actual mathematical expected value that's been calculated for that. I know that the calculation we use to determine what the optimal sliders are is an expected value calc. And where those are set is that highest expected value result. I don't know the actual individual numbers for those. So I guess the answer is no. Not for any reason in particular, but I don't know the actual exact mathematical expected values of different settings there. So another late swap question here from Tone, and this is a good one because I saw this come in last night, and I wanted to talk about this a little bit. So he said, last night on the late slate on DraftKings, I had the winning lineup in my original set of 20, and I played the quarter jukebox. Let's go over to NBA here. Late swap before the Lakers game because part of my process is to always take advantage of the new sims that are run. The late swap ended up changing the lineup. I felt confident in my process and know the danger of overreaction. So I'm inclined to chalk it up to luck of the draw. I'm just curious as to the opinion of some of the team members I like to listen to, viewpoints to those who are more seasoned than I am. Do you feel it was worth it to late swap only to take advantage of the new sims that are run? Or is your school of thought if there's no game-breaking news to just stick with your guns? So, I always lean on the side of late swapping, and I late swapped in the exact same situation you did last night. So we got, I think, a slightly different Lakers lineup than expected. Trevor Ariza was starting, right? So, I mean, the very first thing I did to kind of determine, I saw that the new sims had run. The very first thing I did is go to this Basketball Monster news dashboard, which I've mentioned here a ton on stream, to see what happened, right? I see that the sim gets triggered, and I think, what happened? What changed here? And there was, it looks like we can't go back that far, but there was a note here that said, Ariza starting THT off the bench, right? One of the things I also like to do, and I think another thing that you can kind of add into your process from there, is if you grab the projections from different points throughout the night. So a lot of times what I will do is at lock, I'll just grab the projections, save them, and name them lock projections. And I think I late swapped probably around 7:30 or 8. It's probably about 7:30 Eastern yesterday too. So I late swapped there. So I grabbed those projections. And then what you can do is, if you want one more kind of source to determine what changed here, is to see that the sims run, check your news dashboard. Okay, there's a different starting lineup than was expected. And then what I actually did is I went in and I checked, what was Ariza's projection, what was THT's projection the last time I ran my lineups, and what are they now? I know that's a little tedious. We have talked about adding something like a change log so you could see this just in the app, but for now, I think this works pretty good. And I saw that there was, for a 5-game slate and for the night slate, just a 2-game slate, there was a couple point projection swing between those guys. So I decided to late swap. I thought it was worth it to go in there and do it. There are situations where maybe the projection doesn't change at all, or it's changing by a fraction of a point, where I may just let things ride. I wasn't at my computer last night either. So I kind of had to check this on the fly and then decide to late swap there on the fly. And so that's kind of why I went ahead and did that. But in general, I think it's always better to err on the side of late swapping, right? Taking advantage of the most recent information is almost always, it's just always going to make your lineups probably theoretically higher expected value, right? Now this can happen, right? You can lose and get unlucky here. And I think Shady Advice in chat had probably the best way of saying it, of that, a really good way of thinking about it is you never actually had that original lineup. If late swapping, when this kind of news occurs, is a part of your process, then the lineup that would have banked really was never a lineup that you would have played, because your process says to late swap, and you probably late swapped into lineups that have a higher expected value because you got to take advantage of more up-to-date information in that process. And I think that's the healthiest way to look at it. All lineups have some theoretical win equity apart from just terribly made lineups, but the point is you are trying to increase the probability of certain payout positions with your lineups, right? So if you can, if you have a lineup, I'm just going to throw out random numbers here. This isn't exactly how it works, but if you have your original lineup that has a 1% chance of winning the contest, and you late swap with information, right, that you didn't have before lock, and now you late swap into a lineup that has a 1.25% chance of banking the contest, right? You've made that lineup better, but the original lineup still has some equity associated with it, and it can win. Does that mean it's the better lineup in the long term? No, but it means you had a bad beat last night. And I think that's kind of the way that you have to look at it. For sports where you are going to be late swapping a lot, there has to be some kind of mental thing that you've got that allows you to late swap and allows you to live with the good and the bad with that. what I always think about is when I'm looking at my lineups, when I go into lock, I'm looking at my lineups and exposures for only the 3 players that are playing in the first 3 games, for example, for tonight. I am unattached to anything else going on beyond that. I do not care who my players are, who my exposures are to any of these other games, because I'm confident, I'm essentially certain that it is going to change. And then it will help you get unattached. I think the worst thing you could do is get anchored to the lineups that you played earlier in the night and think that late swapping to take advantage of new information is going to make those lineups worse just because of an anchoring bias, just because you got attached to the lineups that you've already built, right? And it can happen. It happens to me too, right? I had a lineup in the main slate last night that was looking pretty good through the first 3 games. And it was hard to, bite that bullet and be like, no, the Lakers starting lineup is a little bit different than I expected. This is a change in projections on a 5-game slate. Like, I'm going to late swap. This lineup's going to change. The 3 remaining players in this lineup are going to be different. And I'm okay with that because the players that are going into that lineup now are a theoretically better set of players given what we now know. Right. So put another way before I move on here, right? Let's say, the later games on the slate tonight start 3 hours after lock. If all of the games on the slate started at the same time, if they all started at 7 p.m. Eastern, you would never arbitrarily just because use information for some of the games on the slate from 4 p.m. Eastern. You would never do that. You would never take a set of projections that was 3 hours out of date for an NBA slate, right? If I told you I was doing that, you'd think I was crazy. That is what you are essentially voluntarily opting into if news breaks, even sometimes little news, and you are not taking the opportunity to swap your lineups. You're just voluntarily using out-of-date information. Now, can somebody win with old projections? Can they get lucky? Yeah, of course. But the lineups are worse. And I think that's the proper mindset to approach this with. So again, as always, right? I think when you see those sims run, like one of the things that I like to do is I always like to check just some other source. It could be, the underdog NBA Twitter that's plugged into the NBA lineup alerts. I think this basketball monster dashboard is just very easy to just see and just it will allow you to see if something happened, right? Did something change about the state of the games? Because there are sometimes sims run that it's a very, very minor adjustment of maybe just like a minute or two. And even I don't, bother going in and making the adjustment here. But going in and seeing, is there news that is broken? Has something changed about the game? And I do think it's an interesting idea, too, to grab different sets of projections throughout the night to just download them. You'll only have access to this on the advanced plan. I'm realizing that now. So one thing to note there. And then that will allow you to kind of check and see how did projections change. But don't look for reasons to not late swap. Look for any reason to late swap, right? It's not a good use of your time to try to find reasons not to late swap. You should be erring on the side of swapping. So, okay. So another question. This is from Dominator here in Slack. He said, I'm newer to SaberSim and have a question about Yahoo DFS. I was looking into signing up to take advantage of the sign-up bonuses and some early on beginner-only contests. But I wanted to know prior, is the scoring/style closer to FanDuel or DK, or is it slightly unique? I've also heard that Yahoo does not have limits on what sharks play. So how can we attack contest selection for that site? Thanks. Yeah, good question. So let's go ahead and pull this up on the Yahoo side. I know on their NBA product, I think their scoring is identical to FanDuel. So on NBA, they do, we can look at this live here. This is always a good thing to look into before you start playing a site. But I'm pretty sure here, where are the rules? Do a quick Google search here. But yeah, so they do the 3 points for steals and blocks and no bonuses for the double or triple double. So this, I believe, is the exact same as FanDuel. On the football side, half point PPR. So that is also FanDuel, right? No bonuses here either, I think. So I think they look pretty similar to the FanDuel scoring system overall. At least for those two sports. I think signing up for a new site to take advantage of bonuses, beginner contests, that kind of thing is always great. I highly recommend that. On the contest selection side of things, I think basically you kind of end up in a situation where you're getting a trade-off. The thing that is really nice about Yahoo in general is that you're going to pay quite a bit less rake. Typically get about a discount of 5% or so, depending on the stakes that you're playing. DraftKings and FanDuel, most of the low and medium stakes contests are 15 to 16% rake now. You typically get anywhere from 10 to 12% on Yahoo, which is nice. But these contests are a lot smaller. And from the standpoint of effective entrance, right, players maxing these contests out are going to take up a lot of equity in these contests. Yahoo also recently added the ability to kind of manage all of your contests together in one CSV. Since then, I have noticed that for the sharpest players in the lobby, it's not just maxing out the biggest contest, it is playing all of them. I think before you used to have a little bit of an advantage that if you got down to some of the lower stakes, like the $1 stuff, you'd have a lot of sharper players that didn't even bother to enter those because they had to manage every contest they were playing in individual CSVs. Since that change has been made, I've noticed Yahoo, even at the lower stakes, plays a little bit sharper. Now, I think there is still an advantage to be gained of getting the lower rake, but I think it's a little bit tougher now. I still think it can be soft, and the lower rake is nice, but I don't know if it's as soft as it was. I will say one thing that Yahoo does do, don't see any for NBA here tonight. They've been doing it a little bit for NBA, but especially for NFL, is they will do rake free, so no management fee contests, right? Zero rake, and also guaranteed overlay contests where they have a negative rake to basically drive engagement on the site and get people in the door. These contests are amazing. In fact, there's probably no better contest to be playing in DFS than these no rake and overlaid contests on Yahoo every single week. So for NBA, for example, on the slate like tonight, I will mix Yahoo in. It will kind of be a part of my overall contest selection strategy across the variety of sites. For Football Sunday, when they are giving away rake-free contests or overlaid contests, I will be putting essentially 100% of my action on Sunday into Yahoo to take advantage of these, because they are just so... At that point, when you're talking about a difference of paying 16% on DraftKings and 0% or negative 25% even on Yahoo, it's not even close. It is so profoundly better to be playing zero rake contests. These contests also, since they are larger, since football is a bigger sport, you lower the effective entrance issue a bit. Like this contest, I was just talking about it last night with, where is it? Oh, they changed up on this. Okay, this contest is still pretty good. It's a 10,000 person contest, max 100. So still a good contest. Last night, this was a max 25. And I was a little bit more excited about it when it was a max 25, just because it would play a little bit softer. But I think they were probably worried about it filling prior to Sunday. But still a really good contest. And these contests do a little bit better from the effective entrance standpoint on football, which is, just a more popular sport. But in summary, the nice thing about Yahoo is getting that lower rake. I think that's not a negligible factor. I think that's pretty nice. But their lower stakes contests even just end up playing a little bit sharper than you would expect on DraftKings or FanDuel, because they don't restrict people. I guess that's the main point I should have made. They don't restrict people from playing the lower stakes. And when you're talking about a contest that is a $1 with only 5,700 entrants and it's a 150 max, right? I mean, you can see, Papa Gates is sitting right here, right? These big name guys are going to take up a lot of equity in these contests compared to what you might get in an equivalent contest on DraftKings. So a little bit of a mixed bag there, but definitely sign up, take advantage of the beginner contests and the deposit bonuses, because that stuff is just free money. So, but cool. And it looks like Epic Problem linked a video where I was talking about this recently and gave some thoughts too as well. So that is great here. Another question from JDS Dog here. And then we'll jump. We've got a couple other questions that came in Slack, and then we'll jump to the questions that came in live. This question says, is ownership estimated in-house? They are our ownership projections. They don't come from anywhere else. The way that they work, the way that we've set them up, is we take an industry aggregate projection, so an average projection from a handful of other sources around the industry, and then build thousands of lineups at a relatively high variance setting and use the exposures of those certain players in that set of lineups as the ownership projections. So I think there's certain advantages to this. I think some of the advantages are, one, this can happen extremely quickly. So when news breaks, we can update quickly because we don't need this manual oversight process necessarily of someone going in and entering the numbers. It just kind of rebuilds and updates quickly. We also have accurate ownership projections for pretty much every single slate that is out there because it's automated, right? I also think on something that can be an advantage or a disadvantage, depending on the way you group it, is that since this is just built, well, first of all, one other advantage is since that these are built with actual lineups, our ownership projections can often pick up on things that may not be apparent if you were just looking at the kind of narratives of a slate, right? There are certain situations where players at a certain salary band at a certain position will become chalkier because of available value that is available elsewhere in different salary bands and different positions. If there's a lot of guard value, you're going to get additional ownership on maybe more expensive centers and forwards in basketball that may not have any reason for those players to be chalky other than they just kind of fit into lineups. So using an approach to generate ownership that actually focuses on building lineups, I think can be really effective for that. It is also a computer generated, it's a computer model, right? It's an algorithm, which is, I think, a benefit, a pro and a con here. The pro is that it's not subject necessarily to human bias, right? But since what we are trying to do is predict human behavior, there are situations where it can miss. So if there are narratives about a certain slate, I'm talking, revenge games or whatever might cause a certain player to get kind of chalky. There are things like that come up sometimes. It's not going to pick up on that kind of thing. Or even just positive feedback loops of like the DFS tout cycle, right? If there's a certain player that's just getting touted over and over again, right? It may not pick up on that particular player actually getting chalkier. I've been seeing it recently in NFL a lot this season where the industry kind of latches onto a couple low-owned plays. And there's so many people saying this is the good low-owned play this week that player ends up not being very low-owned. The model might not pick up on that particular opportunity either, or that particular kind of steam that's happening with that player. But they are our projections. I think the big advantages are they avoid human bias. They're quick and they are automated for pretty much every single slate. So, turbos, showdowns, night slates, all of that updated as projections update throughout the night, which is great. So, I know, especially on the NBA side, there have been slates where we miss. No model is perfect. Been a popular question this NBA season. People asking, what's up with this ownership projection? What's up with this? Why was this off? It's always something we're looking to improve. NBA moves very, very quickly. There can be profound swings in the projected ownership in the minutes up until lock. But we are always trying to continue to improve the ownership model. So cool. Good question here from Pete. This is the last question that's in Slack, and then we'll jump to the questions that are in YouTube chat. He said, are the contract incentives included in the simulations this week? No, they are not. If you have a read on how that affects the individual projection of a player, I would say that can be a good spot to add value. That is not something that is very easy to model, right? How much is it worth a player like playing harder to win a contract extension or a contract incentive, right? Those are tough. So I think that can be a good spot to add value. If you've got a read on that, I would exercise a little bit of caution just because, in the same way it's difficult for a computer algorithm to determine how much to weight that kind of thing, it's just as hard for a human to do that, right? Does a wide receiver, Cooper Kupp, I think, at least has some incentive, right? Setting records, maybe not contract incentives, but has that record kind of in the back of his mind. How much harder is Cooper Kupp going to play this week compared to every other week to hit that? Or how focused are the Rams going to be on getting him the ball? Or, how put another way, how willing to make a bad decision would the Rams potentially be in the effort to get Cooper Kupp the ball, right? Like those are complicated conversations to think about, questions to answer. So I mean, it is definitely something that's not baked directly into the sim. So if you want to make some adjustments on that, I think that can be a good way to go. But I would exercise some caution in, thinking about that. So, and especially I think one of the reasons why I would exercise a little bit of caution is because I think the impact that might have for me, the way I would think about this personally, is far underweight to the impact that might have on the ownership of the player. So even if there is an edge in saying this player is extra motivated this week to go out and perform, I think that kind of thing ends up creating way too much steam from an ownership standpoint. From what I've seen, that it is outweighed by that at that point, right? If we get just super chalky players that are playing for something this week, count me out. That's my take, but it's not included in the sims. So cool. Let's keep going. Let's see. Jack said, "Hi, Jordan. After running my first set of sims, I adjusted my min or max exposure according to my leverage. When I went back to the home page, my min/max exposure was back to 100. If you adjust the min or max of the leverage page, is only good for the sims run." Yeah. So your exposures that you may set in an individual build are local to that build. So I think it's fine to do a little bit of, practice or prep or research throughout the slate, or throughout the day, but just keep in mind that you can't take these with you when you're gone here. So for NBA in particular, I think that's just another reason that if you're going to kind of leave an impact on the build overall, to pick a couple, pick a group of 2 to 6 players or something like that, that you're kind of focusing on for that particular slate. Because when you are building your final build, sometimes 5 to 10 to 15 minutes before lock to get the last sim and the last information in, you may not have time to set perfect dialed in exposures for every single player in the pool. So, but yes, these are unique to the particular build you're on. So I see Six is back today. Welcome back, Six. We missed you. Ryan said, "Haven't played Yahoo before this year. Will the NBA contest get bigger once NFL ends?" I think sometimes you see a little bump there. The problem is that, NBA or NFL in a lot of ways is kind of irreplaceable, right? No one really gets all of that DFS volume there. There's just a lot of NFL only players out there. Also, it's an awkward time where, NFL doesn't really end, at least from a DFS standpoint, until the Super Bowl's over, and then that corresponds directly with the All-Star break for NBA, and then post All-Star break, I think the excitement for regular season NBA goes down quite a bit, and it just becomes a lot harder of a playable game for casuals, right? If you think there's a lot of late scratches and after lock news now, after the All-Star break, it gets out of control. It is constant, and it's much more, and it's just a difficult experience for the casual player. So I think at times, you can, at times you can see that those contests get a little bit bigger right after football, but I don't think they stay that big for too long. The biggest contest for any single sport is, I would say, pretty much always right at the start of the season. So, but let's see. Did I miss a question from you, Six, here? Oh, here. Let's do this over here. Let me see. It sounds like I missed Six's question. So we'll go ahead. We'll pull it up because we got a little bit of time here. 10 minutes or so left. Let's get this in. We'll do this one truly live. Well, I guess they're all kind of live in this way, but sometimes the questions that come in via email, I get an opportunity to see. Let's see. All right. Okay. I've got your question here. So golf Golf question. Six did said, I emailed it early this morning, but perhaps I should do it a day early. No, I had something else going on right before the stream, which is why I was a little bit late. So I think that one's on me, but I think this is the question here. So question says, going to be trying out the big DK PGA DFS tournaments for the first time ever. Curious if you have any feedback for using SaberSim to get started. Been asking around and watching a few videos on basics like scoring, but curious if you have any experience or can point me in the direction of some good ways to prep and plan when building PGA lineups. I'm hearing that it's not unlike NFL so far as ownership goes, but more so individual ownership versus total. Just looking to soak up any knowledge, tips, or opinions on how SaberSim handles PGA at this point or time. Yeah, it's a tough sport. I'm going to be honest. The reason why it's tough is that first of all, it's a difficult sport to project. It's very high variance, right? And there's very little correlation. I think the only correlation we get at all is sometimes from weather, right? If there's weather for a particular tee time, there may be, performance for, golfers teeing off in a window where there's going to be a little bit nicer weather sometimes can give you a little bit of an edge with correlation, but it's a very minor factor compared to other correlative sports. You are left basically playing a very high variance game and trying to mostly, I would say, get an edge through ownership. But ownership also ends up being pretty efficient, right? A lot of the ownership in general follows the, kind of like a Vegas line chance of winning, like a salary adjusted Vegas line chance of winning, basically. So, I think looking at, you can kind of identify where some of the chalk is going to be by just looking at the overall salaries of the golfers and comparing them against the odds to win on, a Vegas book. And you can often identify where the chalk is going to be when you find discrepancies there. Pricing is generally pretty sharp, but a player that, is the 10th most expensive player on the slate that, is, 20th most expensive player on the slate that it has the 10th highest shot of winning the tournament often is going to be your chalk. And those lines are pretty sharp. So when the ownership follows those, it can be kind of tough to fade overall. I do think one of the advantages here, again, is that since these are actual simulations, right? Oh, this is a no-cut event. So this is actually even going to be a tougher event than normal. One thing that's nice about the cut events is that you end up with this. So these golfers are going to be kind of normally distributed, or at least kind of appear to be normally distributed on this particular week, right? In an event where there's a cut, you get a binary distribution where you'll get the range of outcomes that golfer has when he misses the cut and the range of outcomes that golfer has when he makes the cut. And you have this distribution that's very not normal, right? And we'll leverage those simulations just like we do for other sports with sim variance, which is generally going to be very high for most of the contests you are playing, right? And with everybody else that is out there that is using an average projection and maybe even some just normal distribution randomness, right? We have, I think, an edge with SaberSim because you're pulling from outcomes that actually resemble what happens in real life compared to everybody else that's using a normal distribution and assuming that the most common outcomes for a golfer are around their mean. And that's not the case. Now, on this particular event, it kind of is the case. Right? If Rahm's projected for about 100 points, right? His most common outcomes are around his mean. So assuming a normal distribution is going to be better than it is on average. But for cut events, that assumption's terrible. And I think there's a bit of an edge there just from that alone. Other players not really thinking about these ranges of outcomes correctly. I think the other big edge there is to try to get an ownership edge. I think in general, that chalk gets a little bit over-owned in golf, right? I think a slight edge of a certain player that, whose pure odds to win the tournament are a little bit higher than their salary would indicate. I think that player can get more chalky than they should be quickly. But it can be a little bit of a tough sport to find that edge in. A video where we break this down in much more detail is on our YouTube channel here. Let me go ahead. I had a couple other tabs open here. So let me go back. Hang on. What's going on here? Okay, give me a sec here. Went and logged me out. Actually, Let's just do this. Okay, here we go. Down here, we did this video with Max last year. This was for the U.S. Open, 6 months old now. This probably isn't the best titled video because this isn't really about how to beat majors. This is really just about golf DFS. I'd check this out. This is probably our best piece of content. I think that this video too, 20 minutes, this is a little bit of a shorter one if you want something a little shorter. This is a little older, but both of these videos combined, I think, are probably the best ways to get an idea of how to tackle this particular sport and embrace some of the high variance. And honestly, I think most important thing when you're playing golf DFS is kind of figuring out, what's my edge this week? Because it can be thinner than it is in other sports, right? With NFL, if you're stacking, right, that you've got an edge there already. There's still not enough people that are stacking. They're not taking advantage of the natural correlation that exists in the sport. The edges in golf DFS are thinner, and sometimes it has to be on a week-to-week basis where that edge is, right? Sometimes there's a weather situation and the morning tee time is going to be super windy and you're building correlated lineups of golfers teeing off in the afternoon window. Sometimes it's a week where there is extreme chalk that's developed on maybe just a couple golfers in the 7K range, and being underweight or fading those golfers is your edge because you've gotten an ownership edge there. Sometimes, one of the things that I think Max focuses on a little bit more than I do is diving into deeper stats on course fit or course difficulty or something like that, and making some adjustments to projections or something like that, which is something I think he talks a little bit more about in this 7 Secrets video. So that's kind of my initial start point, I would say, for tackling golf DFS. But I would start slow with it, and invest less of your bankroll than you might be in other sports, football, basketball, baseball, because I really do think that the edge is less apparent, and it's less consistent in golf. It's a little less automatic, right? I can very easily, enormous edge from football right off the bat by building lineups that are correlated. Enormous edge in basketball right off the bat by building lineups in that and late swapping your lineups in basketball, right? Golf, if you told me, what's the edge, I would say it really depends on the week and what you are doing to that particular slate. And no cut events like this, when you have a skilled field of just 39, 40 golfers, and no cut, it's gonna be trickier to find that edge. So. Desmond said, can we just run late swap builds prior to lock, or do we need to run new builds prior to lock? If you have the time, it's always best to run a new build. The reason why is that we're going to rebuild an entire pool of lineups that is built with the most recent information and then give you the best 20 or 150 or whatever out of that. If you just late swap, we're going to take every original lineup that you had and just rebuild it once. So if you only have time to late swap, that's fine. It's going to go a little bit faster. You can get it in. It'll at least have the most recent information. But you get the advantage when you run a fresh new build of building a much larger pool and selecting the best overall lineups from there. So I'm going to hit this question first. I see Ship My Benjamins here as a question too, but this one's a little bit quicker. HC said, I ran a lineup for a 10-man in a 595-player contest. It gave me the same lineup for both. Shouldn't it have been different due to the differences in players for each contest? What that's basically saying is that the best lineup for both of these contests is approximately the same. And when you get down to these, contests here that are small, right, and low sim variance settings, right, you're going to see this, right? Because we're using the projection that was used to build the 10-man lineup is an average projection, is using every single sim we have for that player. And the projections that were used for the 595-person contest use sim variance at 1, which means that we're taking a smaller sample of the available sims, but it's still a lot of game simulations. And the projections kind of work out similarly, right? The higher your sim variance slider goes, right, the higher your variance gets, the more likely you are to see a different lineup each time you run a different build. The lower your sim variance slider goes, the more likely you are to see the same or a very similar lineup each time you run a build. So if you're playing these two contests and you want to put a unique lineup in both, what I would do is just pick a set of sliders that is, kind of in between both of these. Maybe you pick something like this and just build two lineups instead and play the best two overall lineups you can. But that's the reason why you're seeing those two. So, okay. So good question here. Just started my 7-day trial, trying to master or at least maneuver enough to make a move away from the Roto-Grinders optimizer. What tips do you recommend I start with? I see that the Sims give you a player pool. Is it safe to exclude or add more players to go with the Sims pool? And is it recommended to lock in a player you like? Also, how do I swap a player after a lock? Okay, so a few things to unpack here. I'm going to start here and just make sure that I think the most important thing to get about SaberSim that is very, very different from pretty much anything out there is that everything kind of starts from our play-by-play simulations of every single game. So for every single game on the slate, right, we are doing thousands of play-by-play game sims that kind of write out an individual game script of the way that game could play out. So when you look at a projection, right, when you're looking at Jokic's projection of 56.47, that's not just a number that we came up with. That is his mathematical average that he scores across all of the different game outcomes that we have in our sims for that player, right? So 4% of the time he scores 40 points, right? Even though his projection is 56.47, right? He only scores 56.47 approximately about 16% of the time, right? These simulations also allow us to determine how correlated certain players are to one another. So we can look and see we have the actual proper correlation values of, how correlated certain players are to one another on the basketball court. We look at a guy like Embiid, right? We would expect to see that Embiid does have a negative correlation. Correlations are low in NBA, but he has a negative correlation to Andre Drummond. So the reason why I say that these simulations are so important is because it directly affects the way that your lineups are built. And I promise I'll give you some more practical, this is how you should start advice in a second, but I just want to make sure, I want to at least give myself an opportunity to kind of explain this because I think this is important. So when you are building lineups with SaberSim, right, we are weighting different factors here from things that come from the simulation. So how much do we want to take into account the correlation values we got from the sims, right? How big of a bucket do we want to consider of the sims when we build each lineups, right? Each lineup, that's sim variance. The higher this slider is, the less sims we're considering for each individual lineup, the higher variance you're playing with. And ownership fade is how much do we want to consider ownership when we build each lineup, right? The higher this goes, the more we're likely to fade high variance, high owned players, right? So anyway, let's kind of talk about like the practical how to use this here. If you're just starting out, everything you see here on step one, I think can be kind of intimidating. You've got a lot to look at. You've got team totals, right? You've got projections, you've got ownership, you've got exposure. I would recommend mostly leaving things alone here on step one when you're just starting out, and that includes curating your player pool, right? I think on a lot of other tools, the Roto-Grinders tool in particular, you have to do all of your work ahead of time before the build. With SaberSim, you're better off doing most of your work after the build. So I'd leave most of this alone, at least as you're getting started off, and just at least get started with what we call a test build. So a test build, you're going to go in here, you're going to click the new build button, set your drop downs here to what we think is, to what contest you're playing. So if you tell us what contest you're playing, we will set the settings where we think they are appropriate for that particular contest, right? So you can see if you're playing a single entry, smaller contest, you don't need to worry about ownership as much. You don't need to have a high variance lineup as much, right? If you're playing a 150 max, playing the big contest, right? You need to think about correlation a little bit more. Your lineups need to think about ownership fade more. You need to play more high variance plays. So pick these, right? And then what we're going to do is we're not just going to build you the 20 lineups you need for the contest. We're going to build you a pool of anywhere from, we'll recommend 500, but you can make this as big as 1,500. And these lineups are what we call these lineups viable for the contest, right? That we're building you a pool of lineups that we think work based on these settings and these projections. And then you can kind of get to choose the 20 that you want to end up with. And what's nice about this is that you can come in here and leave your mark on the process. You can do some player pool curation here. You can make adjustments to player exposures. You can take some stands. And you know that no matter what, you're picking 20 from a pool of 500 that are already optimized for the contest. So some examples of what that might look like. You may come in here and say, I'm not comfortable playing these two Pacers value guys at 100% exposure in all my lineups. That's a little bit too risky for me. So you could come in here and adjust your maximum exposure and say, don't give me any more than 50% of either of these guys. And what this is going to do is it's going through and sorting through the pool of 500 players and pulling out the best 20 that honor all of these exposure rules. And maybe you have some more adjustments there. Maybe you come and you say, you know what, Trey Lyles isn't even a guy I wanted in my pool. I'm going to remove him here, right? And maybe I'm all in on Embiid if I'm getting Embiid at 7% ownership against the Magic, right? Maybe that's a lock button for me, right? Now, at a certain point, you may run into a situation where you see an error message that says, we can't follow everything you've asked to do here. So it's going to say, we need to expand the lineup pool in order to match your exposures. Continue building. What that means is we can no longer find 20 lineups that match what you've asked us to do here of the original 500 we built. If that happens, that is probably a good sign that you should go back to step one and do some of the things that you were trying to do before the build, but after the build, before the build, so that we can build you a better pool to begin with. So if you knew that you wanted to lock Embiid, do it here, right? And if you knew that you wanted to remove Lyles from your pool, do it here. And if you knew that maybe you wanted to take a cautious approach with some of this Pacers value, you can do that here. But you can always, and I would say in most slates, you'll be able to find that, you know, it's enough to be able to do this stuff at the post-build process. You don't necessarily need to do too much here to start with. So I think the two things that really differentiate SaberSim from a process standpoint is that you're not just working with average projections, you're working with sim data, right? You're pulling real ranges of outcomes and real correlations of players in simulated games into your lineups. And two, that more of the process comes from after the lineups are built than before the lineups are built with SaberSim. So the question I see, okay, so he says, so every time you tweak, it's generating the best 20 of 500. Yeah, so I mean, just to be, this is probably a little nitpicky here. It isn't rebuilding any lineups. It's just resorting and reorganizing the lineups that were already built here. But yes, you've got the right idea. So every time I make an adjustment here, right, to start with, these are just the top 20 with no tweaks, right? These are just the favorite 20 lineups. When we go in here and say 50% Dwayne Washington Jr. maximum, it says, okay, I can't give 100% Dwayne Washington now. So I'm going to give the top 20 where at max only 10 have this guy in it. And then as we continue to make adjustments here, it's just resorting that pool of 20. So, but I think that's the best way. I think that is probably by far the best way overall to get started and get familiar. As you get more familiar with what's going on, I think you can start to work more adjustments into step one or even step two as you see fit. But our goal with SaberSim is that anybody can come in here, basically not even have to look at the slate necessarily if you don't want to, build lineups, know that you've built a really strong pool of lineups for the slate, and then, you know, NBA is crazy, right? News breaks last second. Maybe you only have 10 minutes to kind of make a couple decisions, right? Or a couple stands or whatever. So you do a little bit of research, you build a nice pool of 500 lineups, you know that these lineups are good for the contest you're playing, and you make your couple, like, you know, stands or plays or whatever here on step 3, right? So, whereas, you know, if you only had 10 or 15 minutes last second right before using the Roto Grinders optimal and you just pressed go, you would just get 20 cash lineups, right? Those lineups wouldn't be taking into account variance or ownership or correlation or anything like that, like these lineups do. So that's the idea. But cool. Okay, yeah. And then, so yeah, I forgot about this question. NBA, you have to do a lot of swaps. What is the process after lock? So we have this, I'll show you, I guess I'll show you the kind of the end of this here. So we have this tool called the entry editor, which basically allows you to get your lineups into your contests without having to mess around with the CSVs or manually enter CSVs or anything like that, and also late swap through this tool. So let's go back to this build that we were just doing here, and I'll kind of show you. Actually, let me real quick. I'm going to stop my screen here and log out so I can show you this process from scratch so that you can see this here. Okay. And then I'll pull this back up. All right. Okay. So once you have entered for a particular slate, this is after you have entered, maybe you've gone in and reserved, right? The first thing I'd recommend always doing is going to this entries tab. So make sure you're on the right slate. This is NBA DraftKings main slate for tonight. Go to the entries tab, and it's going to say upload your entries file. We make it really easy. If you just click this download template file button, it'll just automatically download the file from DraftKings, wherever your downloads go on your computer, and you can literally just drag and drop it in here. Oh, wait. Drag and drop. Oh, it didn't work. Okay, I'm just going to... You can also just click the button and load it this way. Wait, hang on. Why is it not working? Okay, there we go. I just needed to refresh there. Okay, so now we're going to pull in my entries, right? These are the entries I had reserved earlier today. So now we'll go ahead. Let's build that lineup pool again. So this is kind of us like going through practicing how we're going to be putting the lineups in and then ultimately late swapping them. So this is pre-lock right now. Maybe we're 10 or 15 minutes before lock. Okay, and let's say we still want to tackle the slate in the same way. So I've been using kind of the example of this throughout the day, but maybe we're being a little cautious with some of the Pacers value. Maybe we think people are going to chase those points there. Maybe I've decided I don't want to play Trey Lyles, and I think that I get a big edge by going all in on Embiid. So this is kind of the way I'm tackling the slate. So I'm going to go in and hit save, right? Now I go to the entries tab. And I'm going to click fill contest with lineups. You've got a couple different fill methods here. Rank is basically going to put the top lineup in your original build as the first lineup into every contest, and then put the second best lineup into every single contest. So you can see I'm entered in the quarter jukebox and the and one here. These two contests are going to get the same lineups in them. Unique would be a unique lineup into each contest. But in this case, I'm going to use rank for now because I just built 20, right? And then I click download and open DraftKings. It's going to save the file again, and I can just go into DraftKings and upload, and I'm in. So I didn't have to mess with the CSVs or anything like that. My lineups are just in. When it comes time to late swap, so now it's after lock, maybe it's a half hour, an hour after lock, and I need to make some adjustments, right? So we can go in here, we'll click update projections so that we get the most up-to-date news, and then I click this swap button, late swap. Same deal here, right? We're going to late swap the lineups thinking about correlation, ownership fade, variance. Click late swap 20. And it's going to rebuild each of these lineups and give us now what it thinks is the new best lineup with the up-to-date information. So now we're in business. So these are rebuilt lineups. Obviously nothing changed because we're just practicing here. But if it did, we would get the most up-to-date information in there. So. All right, cool. I think we'll go ahead and leave it there. Don't see any other questions here. We'll be right back again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern again. Hopefully, I will be on time to that stream. Thanks for everybody being patient with me. I know a few minutes late here today, so appreciate that. But if you have questions as you are getting your lineups in for tonight, as always, pop them into the Office Hours channel in Slack. Email us, support@sabersim.com, and we'd be... or I'd be happy to answer them on tomorrow's stream. Good luck tonight. Josh said 11 games today, but it's about to be a ton of news. I think it's going to be just pure chaos. Let's see how the injury report. The other thing I like about this Basketball Monster dashboard is they have this like very easy to see kind of injury report dashboard or whatever. And it looks like a mess. it's probably going to be another crazy slate, but that's good. That means we're getting an edge out of it. Hopefully some of this news breaks after lock so we can get a late swap edge. But until then, take care. Good luck tonight. See you guys tomorrow.